Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar presentation for the FY17 Grants and Aid Training. My name is Shane Akagi, and I'm with the Office of Grants Management. Thank you for attending today's mandatory session. There's still a handful of people out, but we'll go ahead and get started. So for today's agenda, we'll be going over housekeeping rules for the webinar presentation. We'll then be doing a contract review, going over the monthly reporting, then we'll have a question and answer session. For the webinar, how to use it, there's a panel on the side of the screen. You should see this little arrow here to open it up. There's a hand gesture here, so when I ask you to raise your hands, you can click on that and show that you're acknowledging my question. As well as there's a section for asking questions here. However, I won't be addressing questions until after the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. If you can't see what's on the screen, please raise your hand. Okay. Looks like everyone can see what's on the screen. Now, if you can't hear me, please raise your hand. Okay, good. Looks like no one is having any technical issues today. So today, how I'll be referring to the documents. The monthly reporting forms are the Excel document that I sent out to you a couple weeks ago. Appendix A, that would be your organization's Appendix A that you have negotiated during your contract period, as well as your contract agreement itself. That would have been in the PDF document that your project officer sent you back when you were issued your notice to proceed. Now, there should also be on the side of your screen a section for handouts. That is an Excel file with an example organization. So if you can also click on that to open up for our review when we go over the monthly reporting, that would be great. Now, for questions, you can type them in at any time during the presentation. However, we'll only address them during the Q&A period. Okay, I'm going to pause this here, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our contract review. Now, what I've gone ahead and done was I took out the major sections of the contract that should pertain to you. So we won't go over the entire document itself. Rather, we'll be going over different sections that are important during the contract or during the term of your grant. And I'm sure since many of you, all of you are returning grantees, you're well familiar with this as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with Appendix C, Scope of Work, Section 3. And I'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and turn to that page. Okay. Section 3 deals with non-performance. So in other words, the grace period that you're afforded if your organization falls short of deliverables. So let's take a look at this example for ABC Child Care. In their Appendix A, they've gone ahead and promised to deliver us in October 20 unduplicated children, 3 monthly life skill classes, and 1 community engagement activity. As you can see, the next several months they also have unduplicated children as well as monthly life skill classes and community engagement. But let's look at what actually happened. So this colored portion on the top of the page is their actual deliverables that they've presented in the first 3 months of their grant. So as you can see, unduplicated children in their first month, they're already behind. Monthly life skills are also behind. However, they met their goal for community engagement. For month 2, they're supposed to, they delivered 5, which puts them on, excuse me, they delivered 5 and 4 in month 3. However, because they were supposed to deliver a total of 25 in this 3-month period, they're now in breach of the agreement. As well, with monthly life skill classes, they were supposed to deliver 9 monthly life skill classes. However, they've only delivered 7 so far. Even though they're ahead in community engagement, this would be considered in breach of the agreement, and they would need to go ahead and modify their Appendix A. One of the options we also have is project officers. In the previous months, if you're below performance, we may withhold portions of the payment until you catch up with your deliverables as well. So we'll go ahead and switch back to the contract snippets. Now, how can you amend your agreement? Since most of you have gone through this process before, we'll just go over it real briefly. Changes that are you need to submit to us in writing. However, changes in the scope, objective, or schedule of the grant activity cannot be materially different from what you promised us. So in other words, if your organization is delivering childcare and you cannot in mid-grant switch to senior, or you cannot even in the grant switch over to senior services. Transfer changes to approved sub-grants. Transfer of expenditures to an unbudgeted line item. That would also necessitate a revision to your Appendix A. Budget category variances that exceed 10% of the grant amount. So like, for example, if your budget, the grant amount is $35,000 and total overall variances in your budget is $3,500, you would need to go ahead and request a modification. Let me switch drawing tools to make it a little bit easier to scroll down. Now, all requests for scope, budget, and term modifications need to be received by the department no later than 90 days prior to the end of the grant. So that needs to be also done in writing. And this section here just talks about how if you request for a modification, whether it's extension or budget modification, that the Appendix A needs to be modified as well. Okay, let's switch over again. For requests for grant extensions, just like in modifications to the budget or even modifications to your grant schedule, no changes will be made after 90 days prior to the end of your grant. So you have until 90 days prior to the end of your grant to request any type of modifications and changes to the grant. Okay, let's proceed on to Section D, term. The most important thing in Section D, Section 2, is that costs incurred prior to the NTP date are not allowable and won't be paid. And that goes along with deliverable services. Any deliverable services that were provided prior to the start of the NTP won't be accepted as deliverables for the grant. Now, can I see with raise of hands how many of you are purchasing capital asset? So that's something that's exceeding the greater of either $10,000 per unit or 10% of the grant. Okay, doesn't appear anyone has any grant or capital asset purchases. What about real estate improvements or improvements to real estate? If you can please raise your hands. Okay, one more time, if you have any real estate improvements or changes to real estate, if you can please raise your hands. Okay, given that there's no one that has any real estate or capital asset purchases, we'll go ahead and skip over this section. Now let's switch over to Appendix E funding, and I'll give you a few seconds to catch up with me. Oh, sorry, there is somebody that raised their hand for capital assets. So let's go ahead and go back to take a real brief look at capital assets or real estate improvements. Sorry, I missed that. So now, if you have a capital asset, the grant term then becomes 5 years. And the first 18 months of your grant, you endeavor to continue meeting the continued activity of the grant purchase or intent of the purchase. You'll ensure to have a control system that's in place to make sure that the equipment continues to be safely used, or that you continue to maintain the equipment within that time. Hold on, let me switch to a different pointer. If no longer needed by the city, you'll go ahead and request instructions on how to dispose of the, or how to go ahead and dispose of the equipment. If instructions aren't issued within the 120 days, you can go ahead and sell the asset and reimburse the city with the sales proceeds less $500 or 10% of the proceeds, whichever is less, for the grantee's selling and handling expenses. Now, for real estate purchases, almost the same idea. The title of the grant asset and real estate will still remain with you, the grantee. You'll continue to use the real estate grant asset solely for the purposes described in the terms found under your grant. After the first 18 months of the grant, just like with the capital asset purchases, you'll go ahead and good faith continue to meeting the grant activity purposes until the end of the grant term. You won't encumber the real estate grant asset without approval of DCS. The real estate shall be used in a safe and sound manner. And you'll be responsible for all risks of loss or damage to the property, including but not limited to real estate, grant asset, and other furnishings. During the term of the grant, you'll endeavor to ensure and maintain insurance to cover the real estate grant asset that's required under any applicable state and city law. Okay, we can now move on back to term. And let me smooth down a little bit. All right, Appendix E, funding. Advance payment. Given that we're already midway through the first month, we're midway through the second month of the grant, advance payments would only be available for startup costs related to the grant, and that would be for 10% of the funds. And given that reporting is actually due on December 1st, we've gone ahead and extended the period rather than the 15th of November to December 1st. We'll just go ahead and talk about the monthly report at this point. Okay. Monthly report up to 80% of the grant amount shall be processed and paid upon request by the city on a monthly payment request. And again, it would be due on the 15th of every month and should be sent and delivered to the Department of Community Services at 715 South King Street, Honolulu, Hawaii, Suite 311, 96813. A bit of warning, we will be moving our offices to Kapalamahale in another few weeks, but when we do move, we'll go ahead and update you with our address. Also, because the building is secured, it actually makes hand delivery of reporting much more difficult, and we'll probably be putting processes in place to address that as well. Now, since all of you are returnees, I'm sure you remember this, that for each payment request you submit, you'll be substantiating documentation that substantiates both the fiscal side as well as the deliverable aspects. So we'll go ahead and take a look at those, how to do that in the monthly report section. But again, it's the documentation that's described in Appendix A of your contract. I'd like to point out Section B of Section 2, where it says the grantee shall be required to maintain receipts and accounting records and provide substantiating documentations for up to 3 years after the final payment has been made by the city. And we can randomly audit the financial documentation of any grantee, and that the records must be maintained and readily available by the city. One more section. Each monthly report shall be signed by an authorized signatory of the grantee who will be subject to personal liability and penalty. That's just regular standard language. However, we do have a mechanism in place where if other than the agent authorizing your contract wants to sign the agreement, you provide to us a letter naming the people who will be authorized to sign the payment and status reports, a signature specimen of the person, as well as the authorized signatory's signature. Okay, we'll scroll down to Section 3, Final Payment. Final payment of 10% of your grant funds is available upon receipt of the final report of the grant. The final report is due 90 days after the completion of the grant. So again, until we receive the final payment, until we receive the final report, the final 10% of your grant will be withheld until that time. Now, the section I'd also like to draw your attention to is Section 3, Allowable Costs. This section talks about that all costs paid under the grant must be, first, reasonable. In other words, a cost that's by its nature or amount doesn't exceed that which would be paid by a reasonable person, a prudent person, under circumstances at the time. So in other words, you're not going to be overpaying for any types of services. Secondly, the cost must be allocable. And it's considered allocable if it's related to the scope of the grant, the outcomes provided in the grant proposal, and it's directly benefited the target population that you described in your contract as well. The indirect costs and administrative salaries I'll skip over because you probably talked about that and addressed those issues during your contract negotiation period. Do want to point out that all costs need to be in accordance and determined in accordance with GAAP. Okay, Section 4, Other Payment Terms. We may withhold payments if the costs are unreasonable or doesn't comply with the terms of this agreement. We'll go ahead and notify you in writing of the necessary steps taken to correct any of these issues. And if there's a failure to comply with, if there's a failure to respond within those 10 working days with a plan to address those costs, we'll go ahead and disallow the costs or go ahead and take further action. Okay. We'll go ahead and scroll down to Section 6 of Appendix D. It says all payments made to the grantee are subject to review and later verification and subject to audit by the city. And again, maintain records for up to 3 years after the final payment of the grant is made. Okay. Let's go ahead and scroll down to Appendix F, and I'll let you catch up with me in that. And we're going to be looking at Section 3 of Section 3. I'm sorry, Section 4, sorry. Section 4 of Appendix F, Inspections and Monitoring. So during the term of the grant, we will come out and do monitoring, and that will be done during your normal business hours. And what we'll be requesting for is any documentation that's related to the grant. So available, any transcripts from books and records, could be signage sheets, could be your fiscal records. And again, as we've requested earlier in the grant, go ahead and maintain those records for no less than 3 years after the final, no less than 3 years after the final payment has been made. And this section is a continuation that the books, records, and documents shall be subject at all reasonable times to inspection and review and audit by the city. Most of this is pretty standard since the last time you received your grant. Can I see a raise of hands? Anybody who received grants in FY15 or FY14? Okay. Can't you see some familiar names? And some of you have received funding for FY16. The FY16 grant itself will not be, reporting requirements won't be too different from the FY17, and we'll go ahead and discuss that in a little bit as well. Some of you may have noticed that your term of your grant, the language talks about 18 months, and what that language was put in place for was, if you request for an extension, we're allowing a one-time extension of 6 months. And many of you are probably familiar that in the past, whenever we still need to do an extension or any types of budget modifications, it would need to go through the formal modification process with a signature and executed agreement. What that language does is allows us to go ahead and make changes to the term of the grant, that one-time 6-month extension, with just approval of the DCS director, rather than going through the entire formal contracting process. Okay. We can go ahead and scroll down to Section 10, Conflict of Interest. In the past, this has been some issue regarding contracts that may be awarded to members of the organization. So in other words, if you have somebody in your organization who might be an employee or director, but that person has a very particular skill set that your organization needs, and you need to enter in some sort of agreement or contract process with them, we ask that any of that disclosures is fully disclosed to your organization's board of directors, that the interest is duly approved by a majority of the grantee's board of directors and governing body, and finally, that payments or other value provided to the interested person is reasonable and does not exceed fair market value. Next section we'll be going over is Section 11 regarding procurement and subcontracting and fiscal sponsorships. We don't have any, I don't believe we have any fiscal sponsors in our FY17 grants, so we'll go ahead and just talk about subcontracting and fiscal sponsorships. The key item here is that you just maintain records about and you request for the DCS's director's consent when if you're procuring a service or a subcontract under the grant that exceeds either $10,000 or 10% of the grant amount. You need to follow the guidelines that are listed below. Obtain the DCS director's written consent, follow a procedure, whatever procedures your organization has in terms of avoiding unnecessary or duplicated services. Make sure solicitation based upon a clear and accurate description of the expected services. Enter into contracts only with responsible contractors who possess possess the potential ability to successfully complete the activities. This item E in the past, has given us some issues, but we've gone ahead and made some policy changes that will allow you to go ahead and receive sole service contracts. But you would need to also provide some information to us. What is the purpose for, the basis of the selection? How did you choose the contractor? What is the justification for the lack of competition when competitive bids or offers are not obtained? And also the basis award for cost or price. How did you come about deciding what that sole source contract would be purchased, would be paid? Now for capital assets, like we talked about earlier, if it's a sole source process, again, what is the basis for your vendor selection? Justification for lack of competition or base bids or offers are not received, and also basis for award, cost, or price. The rest of the section just talks about how all of your agreement, you agree to maintain records on how you selected those items as well, or selected those grant assets or subcontracts that are awarded. Okay, before we move on, I'll check to see if we have any questions. One second, I did see a question, but I need to open up that bar. Okay, the question was, will the handouts for the presentation be available later? I will go ahead and post the PowerPoint as well as the monthly report and sample report online to our DCS website in a couple of days, but I will let you know when that occurs as well. Okay, if we can take a few seconds to wait, I'll go ahead and switch the presentation to the monthly report section. All right, thanks for your patience. For the monthly reporting, we're going to be asking for the following documentations. The monthly report, which is the Excel spreadsheet which we sent out earlier, and we'll be reviewing a sample of that in a short bit. Your invoice worksheet, which is the second page of that Excel sheet that we sent out with the monthly report. Supplemental worksheets, this is also in your monthly report spreadsheet that we sent out, and that's to detail any invoices, receipts, canceled checks that are incurred with the different program expenses or through the different items in the monthly report. You have an employee's timesheet, and these supplemental worksheets, sorry, I forgot to mention earlier, could also include like your mileage logs and also telecommunications logs as well, if you're asking for reimbursements with for telecommunications. We're also asking you to provide the Appendix A documents to verify expenses. So those are the documents that you described in your Appendix A that you'll be providing to substantiate the cost. So that would be like invoices, receipts, payroll registers, whatever was in your Appendix A, your organization's Appendix A. Appendix A, documents to verify your deliverables. That would be copies of your program records. And those would be supporting documentation such as sign-in sheets, reports, um, third-party verifications of the deliverable costs. And finally, a narrative. So what the narrative would be is on your organization's letterhead, description of the activities that went on during the grant, during that monthly period. We do not have a standard format for the monthly report, so it would be just how you describe, it would be just a write-up describing your monthly activities during that month. Okay, show of hands. Did all of you get the opportunity to download the documents that are attached to this webinar? It should be on a section called handouts on your webinar bar. Okay, I see a few hands up. So if you didn't get the opportunity to download that handout, please go ahead and do so now, and we'll take a few seconds to allow you to do that, and then we'll switch over to the monthly example. Okay, thank you for your patience. We'll go ahead and get started with the monthly report review. For those of you that received FY16 grants, the monthly report is pretty much the same as we did with FY16. For those of you that didn't receive FY16 grants, this report is a lot different than your previous year's expense reports. So if you can follow along with me. The top half of the monthly report is the fiscal section. So what you would be doing is filling in this section with the first page of your Appendix A. And if you notice, it's in very general terms: direct salary and wages, administrative salaries, professional contract services, program activities. So these columns are broken up just as your Appendix A, the first summary page that talks about your deliverable, that talks about what costs you're using to substantiate, what documents you're using to substantiate your costs would be. So very general terms. Also has a section for budget, and that's where you would put the line items that you have allocated, the budget amounts you allocated into your line items. Previous requested column, this would be occupied if it was beyond your first month, and that would be the sum total of what you requested in previous months. And then your current monthly request. You notice the worksheet is split up into white and yellow. The yellow areas are formulaed areas, and the white section is where you'll be able to fill out yourself. Now, for the requested to date, this column will automatically track what was reported in its previously reported section, along with your monthly reported section, and track how much has been requested so far. Balance section will then subtract what was requested from your original budget and tell you what balance is left in that particular line item. Then finally, you have a section here that has a percentage of budget remaining. This is helpful for us as it allows us to see what percentage of the budget is remaining. For example, it would be a big concern if in the first 2 months maybe you've delivered 30% of your deliverables, but you're asking for 80% of your total budget. And that's something that we would probably need to take a look at as well. The bottom half of your payment request is the deliverable report section, and that's where you put in your deliverables that's in your agreement. And again, for ABC childcare, like we looked at before, it's the number of unduplicated children served, monthly life skill classes, community engagement activities, and they've listed how much they've served in each one of those areas. Each month as you go along, you'll fill in your deliverables along these lines here, and it'll keep a record of what was submitted to date. At the bottom of the report, you'll notice that there's two signature areas, and yes, you will need to sign both areas, one for the cost certification and the other for the deliverable certification. So if you have a program person that does the program activities or does the program portion of the reporting, they would sign here. Then if you have a fiscal person doing the reporting, they would sign here. Okay. Let's take a look at the invoice worksheet, and this is the second page, second tab. And if you'll notice, it's broken down into personnel costs with direct program costs at the top in this area here. You also have a section for administrative costs in this section, administrative personnel costs in this section there. And then at the very bottom of the screen, very bottom of the spreadsheet, I should say, you have a section that details out the other expenses that you'll be requesting for the grant, whether it's professional contractual services, equipment, mileage, and as well as a description here. Okay, let's go back up to the program costs area, or the personnel costs area. You notice they have a program coordinator here, last name Aloha. This is Joe Aloha, their program coordinator, and a caseworker, Jane Mahalo. And as you can see, they put in $1,500 for his gross wages in both areas, suggests that he's salaried, and the substantiation from this would come off of their payroll register. For caseworker, Jane, she looks like she might be hourly because in the first half of the month there was only a little bit of gross payment to her, and then more in the second half of the month. And let's take a pause here, and we'll go ahead and take a look at Joe Aloha's spreadsheet, Joe Aloha's timesheet, which will be something you need to provide. Now, the timesheets that we provided in the payment requests are only templates. If you have your own timesheet that tracks the amount of hours spent in your grant activity, that should be fine as well. But this timesheets are provided for if you don't have timesheets for your organization. So let's take a look at Joe Aloha's, the program coordinator's timesheet. You notice he spent a fair amount of time on the other activities during this period of time, and he spent 84 hours out of a grand total of 168 hours on the grant. As such, the organization will charge only 50% of his time to the grant. Okay, let's go take a look at Jane Mahalo's spreadsheet, timesheet. Now Jane, again, has spent various amounts of time on the grant, and out of a total of 152 hours of work, she spent a total of 114 hours on grant activity. So that means the organization can charge 75% of her time to the grant. Let's go back to the invoice worksheet. So as you can see for Joel, again, because 50% of his time was charged to the grant, they're requesting 50% of his gross wages, and it's reflected here. For Jane, again, 75% of her time was spent with the GIA activity, and therefore they're requesting 75% of her costs in that section. Payroll taxes, this is something that would have been in your budget and an allocated percentage that you put in your budget. So you'd fill in what percentage that was, and the spread and the invoice worksheet will fill out those numbers for you based on what the percentage is here, calculated against the GIA wages here. If you have other fringes that was in your budget, like retirement costs or not, then you can fill the percentage in here, and it'll populate here based off of what the GIA wages were here. Now for health insurance, the organization indicated that their health care insurance per month is $486. However, because Joe worked 50% of the time on the grant, they'll only be charging 50% of the healthcare costs against the grant, because it doesn't make sense if the since Joe worked only 50% of the time that the entire healthcare costs would be charged to the grant. Then you'd have a total here of how much Joe's total costs to the grant would be. For Jane, similarly, payroll taxes calculation based off of the gross, based off of the GIA allocation here. Again, $486 a month for health care, charging it to 75% of her time that she worked on the grant activities, and a total of $1,624 for her total time. Now, there's also another employee that's on the grant, and that's Akamai, Carol Akamai, who's their CEO, who makes about $6,000 a month. They only allocate in their budget 10% because, again, that administrative cost ceiling, which accounts to $300. The 7.65 calculation for fringe benefits comes out to 22. And again, healthcare costs of 724, because only 10% of our time is allocated to the grant, you can only charge 10% of the cost. Now, to substantiate these costs, you'd be submitting the timesheet as well as their payroll registers for each month for review to substantiate the costs that are described here in the salary section. Now we'll go ahead and scroll down to the program cost section. As you can see, ABC Childcare purchased a van for $35,353, and they're asking for reimbursement for during this first month. They've decided that they have an allocation basis of 10% for their monthly rent of $4,166. Utilities costs 10%, again, same allocation of the rent against a $1,250 bill. They purchased pens for $15. And they had about $126 of program activities. So we'll go ahead and take a look at what substantiation they're providing for that. Now, for each one of these other items here, the van purchases, grantee will, or ABC Childcare will probably need to provide their invoice as well as proof of payment, canceled check, or online bank statement with the sections that are not relevant to the purchase redacted, blacked out. Rent invoice would be whatever is described on your Appendix A again, which would probably be an invoice as well as a canceled check showing the amount was paid, just as well as your utility expense as well. Purchase of office pen, if it's done on a credit card, it would be just the receipt itself. Now for the program supplies, we do have a supplemental worksheet for that. And if we take a look at this, you'll notice that they purchased some art supplies for their program from Office Depot, totaling $113, of which 100% of the allocation was charged to the Grant and Aid program, and thus they're asking for $113. Now on the 12th, they also got program food from Foodland, but only one item from their receipt was probably tied to the grant. So out of their total of $45.65, 30%, or just $13.70, was related to the program, and they would provide the receipt as well as if there's a canceled check for that item on this area as well. We've also provided you with supplemental worksheets. If there's telecommunications or if you're reimbursing cell phone bills, you can put in the service period here, who the vendor is, your receipt, what percentage you're charging to the GIA, and the GIA expense. And this will tie into what you've placed in your invoice worksheet. We've also provided you with a supplemental mileage log. If the organization doesn't have a mileage log, it would describe what vehicle you're driving, the date, starting location, destination, any notes about what was being done, your odometer start and end time mileages. It'll calculate mileage reimbursement here, and it'll tell you what mileage is here, and then it'll calculate the reimbursement here. So for FY16, it's very similar to what we've done. For FY17, it's very similar to what we did in FY16. However, it is much more different than if you received a grant in FY14 and FY15. And now if there's, you can go ahead and start asking your questions. I'll go ahead and take a look at what questions there are, and we'll go ahead and start answering them. Okay, there's a question about, can I move a sheet to the left? Can't see where you are. I'm sorry, which sheet would that have been? Okay, we'll go ahead and wait for a follow-up question from that person. Does anybody else have any other questions regarding the payment requests? Okay. Looks like that worksheet was addressed. The question was addressed about the worksheet. Anybody else have any other questions? Wow, no questions. Okay, if you have, oh, sorry, one more question just popped up. Would anything less than 100% of the deliverable activities be considered a breach of the contract, or is there a tolerable value? No, if the deliverable, if anything less than 100% of the deliverables are delivered at the end of the grant, if you're asking if it's at the end of the grant, then no, we would probably need to withhold money at the end of the grant. Okay, is there any other questions? If anything does come up during this time period, you can go ahead and make sure to contact your project officer, and they'll be glad to work out any issues you have with them. Again, for your first month, which would be October, the deadline has been extended to December 1st in order to give you some time to get used to the reporting or whatnot. That doesn't preclude you from submitting your request earlier if you're comfortable with submitting and if everything is ready. Okay? Any other questions? Okay. If there are none, thank you very much for attending the workshop, and good luck, and we'll see you later.